Okay, most of you have probably heard about something about space, but most of the time, people just ignore it. Most of you probably know, but since the end of World War II in 1945 and until the early 90s, the Soviet Union and the U.S. were in a Cold War, so to speak, and there was many competitions they were in. One of the most well-known is what's known as the space race nowadays, which began in October 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1 into space. After the launch of Sputnik, Americans were outraged, and for nearly the next decade, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were trying to see who was going to win this so-called space race. The first step was for the U.S. to launch their own satellite into space. Next, both countries had their own failures and successes in terms of this, but the ultimate and final goal was set by President Kennedy in 1961, and that was that by the end of this decade we will land a man on the moon and return him safely. After the launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957, American scientists started to develop their own satellites. Work began immediately at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, to send a satellite to explore the space around Earth. The first time the U.S. tried to launch a satellite to space, the satellite blew up after takeoff in December of 1957. The success of the U.S. satellite came in January of 1958 when NASA sent Explorer 1 into space to explore what was around us and found what we now call the Van Allen radiation belts, named for the scientists who created the Explorer 1. Like most countries, the U.S. and the Soviet Union had their fair share of successes and failures, and especially during the space race. Most of the successes that the Soviet Union had were in sending the first living creature into space, a dog named Laika, in Sputnik 2, sending the first man, Yuri Gagarin, in Vostok 1, and the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, in Vostok 6. The U.S. had its fair share of successes as well, such as the first weather, navigation, reconnaissance, and early warning and communication satellites, sending Alan Shepard Jr. into space and back down, and sending John Glenn orbiting the Earth in the Mercury capsule known as Friendship 7 in 1962. But both countries had their fair share of failures as well. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union had some rocket explosions on their own launch pads. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy issued a challenge to Americans by saying that by the end of this decade we will land a man on the moon and return him safely. With the President's challenge in mind, NASA began working on its lunar program, which they called Apollo, while Soviets launched their own known as Soyuz. In 1967, the first lunar spacecraft known as Apollo 1 was ready, but while it was going through flight procedure, fire got started in the oxygen-pure environment and killed all the astronauts aboard. And for the rest of the year, Apollo program for manned missions was put on hold. Soviet Union was not doing much better because both Soyuz 1 and 2 caught fire. The final success of the space race was accomplished in July of 1969 when Apollo 11, carrying astronauts Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Edwin or Buzz Aldrin, landed on the moon, and the words that Neil Armstrong spoke: "This is one small step for man, but a giant leap for mankind." The first step was in conclusion, the first step was for the U.S. to launch their own satellite. Next was the failures and successes in terms of the race, and the final goal by John F. Kennedy was the landing on the moon. With President Kennedy's goal accomplished, Americans won the space race, and the Soviet Union conceded defeat, although President Kennedy didn't live to see the day the challenge was accomplished since he was assassinated in 1963. That's it.